Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar of the year. It's a makeup for January. And we're going to start out this webinar today by asking you guys an icebreaker question. So last time, a couple weeks ago, if y'all were here, I asked what died in your yard, but this time I'm going to ask, what houseplant have you had the best success keeping alive? And I have one, I don't know what it's called. I took a cutting from somewhere and it like grew into my screen and it's just like climbing through and it is just like flowering right now and it's very happy. So if you have a house plant that you've had a lot of success with, or maybe your favorite house plant, let us know in the
Wait,
chat.
Claire, you got me curious. You don't know
Yeah,
what this plant is that you're having success with? It's flowering?
I don't know what it is. I'll have
Oh,
to take a picture.
shame.
Ah, I know. Well, when
Now
you
you're going to have to email me a photo because there's aren't that many plants that really seem to, is it vining?
kind of it's a No, it's just got little orange white flowers, and then it has yeah, it just has gotten taller, and then the part of it has like cascaded. All right, let's see what we have. Well, what's yours, Mark? What's your favorite houseplant? Which I'm sure it's very happy.
Oh, do you ask a parent what their favorite child
Yeah.
is?
Okay, I take it back. I take it back. All right, we got. Well, let me tell you what some other people said. Swiss cheese plant. Okay, mine dies every time. Okay, money tree.
ZZ, yes, tough as nails.
These are awesome. Okay, we got mini ferns, succulents. We got some renewed interest here. Yes, obviously succulents are, I love them. Peace lily, good. Um, what else? Oh, spider. Oh, can't keep spider plants alive. What? But you can keep monstera alive. Excellent.
That's kind of
Mm-hmm.
special.
That is a special. I'm very impressed.
Now,
African violet.
Jean is saying she has a dwarf snake plant that's 40 years old. I can top that. My mom, who is 96, has a snake plant that she got from her mother in law when she was a newlywed. So you do
Wow.
the math,
Wow.
probably 75 years old
That is
snake
impressive.
plant. Yeah.
That is
And my
impressive.
mom's not a good plant caretaker. So I was like, it's been in a dark corner with infrequent water for decades.
Well,
Bloody.
these are all invasive plants. However, are they invasive? A lot of them are, but we're keeping them in pots in our house. So that's why we're talking about these today, to talk about house plants. Some of these, yes, if you put them outside, they're not great. But if you keep them inside, they can be great. Let's see what else we have here. Ooh, Tillandsia. Wow, you can keep Tillandsia alive. I always kill those air plants too.
I'm intrigued by Julie said Bloody Mary. I don't know a houseplant called Bloody Mary.
I don't either. I've never heard of
I think of Bloody Mary as a cocktail.
that. Um, oh, Christmas cactus. Yeah, those are fun. And those can get
Mm.
really old too, right? That's great. We just did a Flip My Florida Yard in Broward County. We did a filming and we tore out a bunch of Sansevieria, and they were like 4 feet tall because they are invasive if they're outside, but they're great when they're inside. And so I definitely saved a bunch of Sansevieria to put on my desk at work. And then my mom saw them. My mom wants some. So anyway, all right, y'all. Well, it is 11:04. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Give everybody a chance to get all checked in. This is our makeup webinar. It was originally scheduled for January. My name is Claire Mitchell. I am the education manager in the state office for Florida Friendly Landscaping. We're joined today by Marc Frank. He is an extension botanist and associate collection manager at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and he's going to speak with us about houseplants. Okay, first of all your mics are muted. So if you have any questions, you're going to type them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. The chat box is going to be closed. We're going to answer Q&As at the end of the presentation. And we're going to have a little exit survey when we're done with the presentation. That would be really helpful if y'all could fill that out and just lets us know how we're doing. and if there's anything that we can improve. Our next webinar is going to be held on March 18th at 11 a.m. We're going to be joined by Chris Marble. He's the Associate Professor in the Environmental Horticulture Department at UF at the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center. And he'll be talking with us about understanding homeowner herbicides and using them safely. So today we have Marc Frank. He's the Extension Botanist and Associate Collection Manager at the University of Florida Herbarium. This is part of the Florida Museum of Natural History. He specializes in plant identification, horticulture, horticultural systematics, and he has a keen interest in botanic garden collection management. So thank you for joining us today, Marc, and please take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Claire. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, so I really enjoy growing houseplants, and I have for a long time, and I'm happy to share my enthusiasm for the topic with you. So, in case you didn't know it, houseplants are having an extended moment. Houseplant sales have actually been trending upwards for several decades. According to the National Garden Association, there's already been a 50% increase in houseplant sales just in a 2-year period from 2017 to 2019. And then at the peak of the pandemic, between spring 2020 and spring 2021, Garden Center magazine, which does a survey of independent garden centers throughout the United States, they polled all of their member independent nurseries and asked them what category of items saw the greatest sales. This is a survey they do on an annual basis and have for about 20 years. And in that period from spring 2020 to 2021, houseplants, including tropicals and succulents, saw the biggest increase in sales, which was more than any other category sold in nurseries, including vegetables and herbs, fruits, annuals, perennials, outdoor furniture, hard goods like pottery, and so on. So this was the first time that houseplants had ever taken the leaderboard since this Garden Center magazine started the survey in that 1-year period. And since that time, since 2021, houseplant sales are still growing. They're kind of tapering off, leveling off, but they're no longer the top category for the past 2 years of survey results from Garden Center magazine. Houseplants have dropped down. They've been overtaken by perennials 1 year, by vegetables another year, but they are still, overall sales are increasing. And Generation Y and Z, which is folks in the age of 18 to 34, account for about a third of annual houseplant sales. And there is this mantra amongst those generations that pets are the new kids and plants are the new pets. So in a way, with this younger generation, there's been an enormous enthusiasm for growing houseplants. And a lot of this is a way that they can make a rental space homey and also start to care for something without the commitment and expense of actually having a pet or having a child. And I thought this was interesting. The market value of indoor plant sales in North America last year in 2024 was $6.6 billion. I mean, try and wrap your head around that, $6.6 billion. But based on the current rate of growth over the past 10 years, that's expected to be $28.6 billion in 2031. So that's just mind-boggling that there are so many people interested in purchasing houseplants in North America that it could total $28.6 billion in sales. So houseplants, particularly with this younger generation, are increasingly prominent on social media, also on video sites like YouTube. And there's a whole group of plant influencers who are well known across the country. Just an example, I'm not a social media person, but I kind of lurk on the edges, and there's a site on Instagram called Houseplant Club, which at certain points of time has had as many as 1 million followers at a time. I think when I checked last, it had dropped somewhat. Another indicator is that there are new houseplant books being published all the time. So when I look on Amazon and I search for books and I just type houseplants, I'm blown away at how many new plants are still coming out. The market isn't saturated, and people are hungry for information on caring for their plants. There are also a whole bunch of houseplant startups, including the Sill, Rooted, and Tula, that have really spearheaded nationwide mail order plant sales. On the right side, you can see, probably most of you have heard of a food truck, but Tula was spearheading having houseplant trucks that were setting up in the streets of Metro New York City. And so they take the trucks to different places and sell houseplants, particularly specimen houseplants that people could use to really make an instant impact in their space. At, I might add, very premium prices. This is New York City after all. And their sales just went through the ceiling. And the Sill is one of my favorite stories. It was started by a woman named Eliza Blank, and she and a friend, I think, each put in $10,000 into starting a business, and they had a Kickstarter campaign and they raised $26,000. So with a total startup cost of $36,000, she started this business called the Sill that would sell everything from small house plants to specimen size house plants to macrame hangers and all different kinds of containers. And within 5 years, she was netting $1 million. So it just told you that the time was right, that she tapped into this extreme public, nationwide interest in growing houseplants. And the other thing that I've really noticed, I'm in Gainesville, and we've lost a lot of our small local nurseries to the big box stores over time. But what I noticed since the pandemic is now Gainesville has at least 3 different stores specializing in houseplants. So even in smaller towns and in markets that have had difficulty maintaining independent retail nurseries, they are supporting stores that are specializing in houseplants. Of course, another indication that houseplants are enormously popular is the prices that they're commanding. So this is a page from an unknown, unknown to you, known to me, nursery here in Florida, which is selling little 4-inch starter plants. And you can see that the prices of some of these plants in the aroid family are ranging from $1,200 to just over or just under $300. Of course, they have cheaper plants as well, but this particular page caught my eye because of the range of prices. And the very first time that I did this presentation, it was an in-person presentation. When I brought up this slide, there was a gentleman in the front row who muttered very loudly, "People with more money than sense." And he may have a point there. I probably would not buy a plant for $1,200. I don't make that kind of money. But the fact that there are people who are so enthusiastic about collecting and acquiring plants that they would consider spending that amount of money tells you what a popular pastime it has become. However, I'm just here to tell you that you don't have to be a young person. You don't have to be a hipster. You don't have to be an urbanite or very affluent to enjoy houseplants. My grandma grew houseplants. My mom grew houseplants. As soon as I moved out of the dormitory in college into my own apartment, I had houseplants. And if you don't already, you can have houseplants too. So there's a whole bunch of factors that influence how plants will perform in an indoor setting. And I'd like to talk about each of these factors separately. They're going to include light, the growing media, what type of container you're using, water and humidity, fertilizer, and most importantly, what type of plant you're choosing, that is the plant species selection. So let's dive into each of these. The thing to realize is there's not a one size fits all recipe for success with growing houseplants. Just because you can get away with watering your succulent plants every 2 weeks and having them in a south-facing window doesn't mean you can do the same thing with African violets or with foliage plants like philodendrons. So we've got to be practical in realizing that different plant species come from different geographic areas and from different types of habitats. And so they will have different cultural requirements. And similarly, each home and each room within a home is going to have different environmental conditions, particularly in terms of light, but also sometimes in terms of airflow. And that will also have an impact on plant performance. So just because you have success with succulents in one room of your house with a south or west facing window doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have success with that same type of plant in a different part of your house with a different exposure. So light is really, to me, the most critical factor influencing plant performance, not just indoors, but outdoors as well. And the reason for this is because light is essential to photosynthesis. If, in case you've forgotten, photosynthesis is the process by which plants convert water and carbon dioxide using the energy of the sunlight, and they make a molecule of sugar with some oxygen as a byproduct. So they're basically producing a form of calories that they can burn to fuel their growth. We think of fertilizer as plant food, but it's just mineral building blocks. The actual calories that plants use for growth and metabolism come from photosynthesis. And if there's not sufficient light, there won't be sufficient photosynthesis. So there's several different aspects of light that influence plant growth and metabolism. One is light intensity, which is typically measured in units called lux or foot candles. And what 1 foot candle is about 10 3/4 lux. There's also the light spectrum or wavelength, which is measured in nanometers. And you guys have probably seen that wavelength chart that runs from infrared to ultraviolet with the various colors of the rainbow in between. And that's just basically telling you the length, the wavelength of that particular light, and different wavelengths are used for different plant functions, with red and blue light playing the greatest role in photosynthesis. Another aspect of light that plays a role in plant growth and metabolism is the relative duration of light. That is the relative length of light versus dark period, which of course changes through the year with a greater dark period in the winter months and longer light or day period in the summer months. And this has a pretty profound influence on plant growth, both indoors and outdoors, but it also has a big impact on flowering for a lot of species. So of course, we're familiar with African violets and poinsettias developing their flowers with a shortening day length in the fall into winter. But also I've noticed notice that things like the Phalaenopsis, the moth orchids, tend to flower more heavily, that the flowering is triggered by a shortening of day length in the winter, and then as day length is increasing into early spring. So light intensity, light spectrum, and light duration all play a role in indoor plant performance. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, light needs will vary from plant species to species. So here's a very basic chart, which is breaking down different groups of plants into categories of low light, medium light, and high light, with low light plants being those that can use about 50 to 250 foot candles, medium at 250 to 1,000 foot candles, and highlight at over 1,000 foot candles. And what you'll notice is the plants in the low light category are those we typically think of as tropical foliage houseplants. When we get to more flowering plants and plants that some of the succulents like jade plant, the ficus trees, some of the flowering things like Hoyas and peperomias and African violets, a lot of the ferns are actually medium light. They won't perform quite as well under low light conditions. And then with things like orchids, herbs, most of our flowering plants, indoor fruit trees, cacti, succulents, bromeliads, they are generally considered to be highlight plants, though with some of them, they can be very slow to show that they're unhappy if they're grown in less than ideal light circumstances. And if you're looking for more information on light for houseplants and some recommendations, you can go to the Gardening Solutions website and look for the topic light for houseplants. I've got a whole page about this. So, you can measure light intensity using a handheld device called a light meter. And I read about this in a great book, which I'm going to recommend to you later on, called The New Houseplant Parent by Daryl Chang. And in it, Daryl is a scientist by training. He's an engineer. And so he took a very methodical approach to growing plants in his apartment. And the first thing he did was acquire a light meter and kind of really suss out what the light conditions were in different rooms in his space. And I was like, I've been growing plants for 30 or 40 years and I never thought of this myself. So I went onto Amazon. I actually purchased a very similar model to what Daryl had been using. And I started measuring light in different areas of my house where I was growing plants. One of the things that I was quickly able to document, which I had read, is that a pane of window glass typically reduces light intensity by anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on the thickness of the pane of glass. Light intensity is further reduced about 10% for each additional foot that you move away from the pane of glass. So if you've got a coffee table with a houseplant that is sitting 3 feet away from a window, then that is an additional 30% reduction over the 30 to 50% reduction that you're seeing from the pane of glass. Of course, there's a significant difference in light intensity and windows on the different sides of the house, with southern and western exposures typically being stronger, hotter afternoon sun, eastern exposures being more morning sun that's a little more moderate, and most north windows rarely getting direct sunlight at all. And you've also got to realize that light intensity is further impacted by trees in the landscape outside your windows, by roof overhang, by window screens. If you've got double paned glass in your windows for efficiency reasons, that's a big decrease. So there's all kinds of things that are impacting what we might perceive to be pretty good light in front of our windows. So as an example, this is a picture window in my own home. I call this my Florida room, and it has a 6 foot by 4 foot picture window with my desk right in front of it. And since the time I moved into this house 26 years ago, I've always had plants on this desk. This is a north-facing window, and I perceived this as a trained botanist and horticulturist. I perceived this to be one of my best spaces for growing plants because it was this big window. So what I did is I got my trusty light meter that I'd purchased, and I went outside of this window. I stood on the patio 10 feet on the outside of this picture window, and I measured that there were almost 12,000 foot candles, which is in the highlight category. And then I stayed outside, but I just walked closer to the window. I got 3 feet outside the window, and just by getting closer to the roof overhang and closer to the shade of the building, that went down by almost 10,000 foot candles. So the light intensity dropped to 910. When I held the light meter directly outside the pane of glass, it further dropped to 600 foot candles. When I walked inside the house and then held the light meter directly inside the pane of glass, it dropped to 380 foot candles. When I moved it 1 foot inside the pane of glass, it dropped to 310 foot candles. And then when I was 3 feet in from the pane of glass, it dropped to 230 foot candles. So what I want you to notice is in this space, which I was perceiving as one of my best, most well-lit spaces, even right up against the pane of glass, it was only 380 foot candles, which is considered low light intensity. So the end result is that I had things like African violets in that window, which were actually growing slowly and flowering sporadically. And it's because I was starving them to death for light. So to conclude, light is really the primary factor that is influencing houseplant performance. And even though some plants will tolerate low light, over time, less than ideal light conditions are going to result in slowed growth, a kind of lanky, stretched out habit, fewer leaves, a lack of flowering, and a greater likelihood that you're going to have pest or disease problems. The good news is that grow lights have become increasingly more affordable and energy efficient. And these really have had a big impact on the range of plants that we can grow indoors. The things that have driven this improved technology, particularly in LED grow lights, is the indoor marijuana production, growing plants in space, and indoor vegetable production, which have all become big economic drivers. And as a result of those, now LED grow light technology has trickled down to the consumer level. And there are an infinite variety of choices of grow lights available on online vendors like Amazon. And I've been experimenting with these, over the past 4 to 5 years and have just been tremendously impressed by how much better my plants have been doing with supplemental LED lighting. And what's more is that I've seen a very minimal increase in my power bill. And with these LED lights, most of them have a minimal heat output. So I don't have the same problem with potentially burning plants like you will with fluorescent light fixtures, or particularly with the old school sodium lights, which got very hot. And there are LED light fixtures ranging from full spectrum, focusing on red and blue light, varying qualities, more and more with replaceable bulbs so that they can be used for a longer period of time and aren't as disposable. So if you are having difficulty succeeding with plants in your indoor space, Mark suggests that you recommend evaluating your light conditions and potentially making an investment in some LED grow lights. So now let's talk about growing media. Potting soil. And most bagged potting soils consist of a mix of components, including peat, some pine or hardwood bark, sphagnum moss, wood chips, sand, compost, perlite, which is the white stuff you see in the upper left corner of the image on this slide, vermiculite, which is a moisture retainer on the lower right corner of the image, and a wetting agent so that when you actually apply water to the soil, it helps it absorb the moisture rather than just having the water run through. So each component in a bagged potting mix will contribute different properties to the mix in terms of how acidic or alkaline it is, the cation exchange capacity, which is the ability of the potting media to hold on to nutrient ions, the texture and porosity and the moisture retention are all influenced. So there are different mixes designed for different types of plants, depending on whether they're moisture lovers or they're succulents that need really well drained, or they're epiphytes that typically grow up in trees and they need uber well drained. So different mixes for different types of plants. So the magic is in the mix. The thing I'll tell you is that in general, garden soil is going to produce poor results in container grown houseplants. Particularly here in Florida, we tend to have pretty sandy garden soil, which can create drainage problems in a container setting so that you have difficulty with compaction and moisture absorption using your average garden soil in a container. So bagged potting media generally produce better results, but the other thing to know is that bagged media are generally steam or heat treated. They're pasteurized, which kills disease pathogens, weed seeds, and the eggs of insect pests like roaches or other small pests that can be in garden soil. So a bagged media is giving you a clean start. Now, there is a whole category of bagged potting media that are called professional, and those generally contain a higher proportion of peat and sphagnum relative to wood and bark. But as I'm going to mention in a couple of slides, peat and sphagnum are non-renewable resources. The peat bogs are being depleted globally, and so there's been a lot of horticultural research on substitutes like coconut fiber, also known as coir. And so you're also going to see professional mixes that are non-peat or sphagnum based. But when it comes to potting mixes, you usually get what you pay for. So the $2 special that you get from the Walmart is probably not going to do as well for that plant that you just spent $25 on as a $10 or $16 bag of potting mix. And if you're looking for a good quality mix with a guaranteed pH and container cation exchange capacity, you want to go for a higher quality or professional mix. And as I said, different plant species require media with different properties. So when it comes to containers, the important thing to realize is there's actually a gradient within a pot. This is intuitive since we know that water drains downward. So in the typical pot, the lowest water content is near the upper part of the pot, and the highest water content is in the soil at the bottom of the pot. Also, potting media with larger particles generally has a smaller saturation zone at the bottom of the pot relative to a potting media with finer particles. And also shorter, squatter, broader pots generally hold more water relative to the total volume of the pot compared to taller, narrower pots. So if you have a plant that is generally thought of as a moisture lover, like a peace lily, or you're growing mint, or you've got other things that have a reputation for being moisture lovers, like a number of ferns, using a broader, shallower pot is going to mean that you're going to have a deeper saturation zone at the bottom of the pot. And conversely, if you're growing plants where there's a high risk of root rot, think about some of the succulents that are easy to overwater, particularly if they're getting less than optimal light. And the result is you get stem or root rot. By using a taller, shallower container, you're ensuring that there's a smaller saturation zone at the very bottom of the pot, which the succulent roots are less likely to be standing in. The other thing is I grew up with my mom breaking apart old chipped pots and putting broken pots or gravel, or I've seen people use styrofoam peanuts in the bottom of a pot. This is one of those old traditions that is not substantiated by research. The idea was that it would improve drainage in the pot, but actually the exact opposite is the truth, that research has shown that going from a finer textured potting media to a coarse textured gravel or broken crockery impedes drainage and causes water to back up at that intersection above the coarser stuff at the bottom. So you just want to have the entire pot filled with the potting media, nothing added at the bottom to improve drainage. Watering and humidity is also really critical in different species. As we've said with these other factors, different species are going to have different moisture and humidity requirements. Most foliage houseplants, the things that don't usually flower, want more humidity than is necessarily comfortable for people in their homes. Think about tropical rainforest understory environments with a high canopy that's holding a lot of moisture in, and they are often very humid environments with a heavy layer of organic matter like leaves on the ground surface. So there is this very nice, moist microenvironment between the canopy and the ground surface. And that is where a lot of these foliage plants that we grow indoors come from. Of course, most of us don't want 80% in our households. We would perceive that as being very uncomfortable. But what's more, we're more likely to have problems with mold and mildew, and it will smell in our house, and our leather goods and our books will mildew. So, if you're looking for plants that are more tolerant of lower humidity conditions, like we typically have in an air-conditioned or heated indoor environment, look for plants with thicker leaves, with a waxier cuticle or outer layer to the leaves. So think about things like rubber trees, which have a relatively thick, waxy leaf. Thinner textured leaves are more likely to show brown leaf tips or damage in suboptimal humidity. And also, it's possible to create little humid microclimates like you see in this photo on the right-hand side of the slide by grouping plants together. When you've got plants closely together, it mimics that understory habitat of a subtropical rainforest. Also, using a shallow tray with some gravel and pouring some moisture so that the plants are not sitting directly in standing water, but just above standing water. Also, using a spray mister, particularly in the months where you might be running the heater inside your home and the humidity will really drop noticeably, or perhaps perhaps if you've got one spot where you're really growing a lot of plants indoors, like a Florida room that becomes very dry during the winter months, you might want to consider using a humidifier, though I will have to say humidifiers require a fairly high level of maintenance. And if you don't care for them properly and use distilled or deionized water, you can start to create problems with fungal spores in your air. So you got to use humidifiers with caution and be aware of what you're doing. The other thing to realize about plants and water is that water needs vary during the year, with plants requiring more water in the summer months with greater day length and warmer temperatures. And generally, the plants are going to require less water in the winter months when the days are short and the temperatures are cooler. Also, a lot of us tend to pamper our plants, and every time we think they might be wilting a little bit, we give them a little sip of water, and we do that more frequently. But research has shown that watering less frequently, yet more heavily, will encourage plant roots to penetrate through the entire soil level within the pot so that they'll go down towards that saturation zone at the bottom of the pot. And then they are more likely to be drought and wilt resistant when the root system is penetrated throughout the soil. The other thing that I'm a firm believer in is a couple times a year, I take my houseplant outdoors. I don't actually put them in the yard. I put them on cement under my carport, and I give them a thorough hose down. So I not only saturate the growing media so heavily that water is running freely from the base, but I also wash off the foliage so that it is dust-free and the leaves will be able to photosynthesize more efficiently. Now, in this case, you see someone putting houseplants in their kitchen sink as a way of really saturating them, but this is a big way to make a dirty mess inside your house. Back in the days when I was an apartment dweller, I used to put my houseplants in my bathtub to saturate them. But if you've got access to an outdoor space that is not in direct sun, that's protected, and where pieces of the plants can't break off and escape into the wild, it would be best, if you're going to do this, to put plants outside under shelter to really give them a thorough hose down and saturation. And lastly, let's talk about fertilizer. As I said, fertilizer is not really plant food per se, but a source of mineral nutrients which are needed for physiological processes and as building blocks for the molecules that plants are building. They're not really a source of calories. Plants do make their own calories through photosynthesis, which I discussed is this alchemy of combining carbon dioxide, water, and light energy to make a molecule of sugar plus some oxygen molecules. And when it comes to fertilizer, there's a group of nutrients that are really essential. Those are called the macronutrients, and they include nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And of course, don't forget those ambient environmental nutrients, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which are in air and water. And then there's a set of nutrients which are needed in much smaller quantities, and those include iron, manganese, boron, molybdenum, copper, and zinc. And this chart from UF IFAS is showing you that the soil pH, or relative acidity or alkalinity, has a pretty profound effect on the ability of the plant roots to absorb the nutrients that are present in the soil, and that optimal absorption for most of the nutrients, they can be absorbed at the proper level, roughly in the area of a 5.4 to 6.4 pH, which is relatively acidic. What you'll see is if you get too acidic, then the plants will start to absorb larger quantities of the micronutrients, which can lead to toxicity. And at too alkaline of a soil media, there can be additional problems with absorption, either overabsorption or underabsorption, that can also lead to problems with the plants. So imbalances don't just affect how the plant grows, but they'll also affect the efficiency of the soil environment for the roots. So you'll get an accumulation of soluble salts within the medium. That's that crusty stuff that you see on the inside of the pot, and it will impact plant growth and performance. So there are different options for fertilizer. You can go with the cheaper soluble blue stuff. You can go with granular stuff that you sprinkle on the surface. There are organic fertilizers, which a lot of us think of as being very environmentally friendly, but realize they're generally going to have lower levels of nutrients, and they're going to need to be broken down by soil microorganisms like bacteria and fungi to be in a form that is available to the plant. So they're slower acting. So most recommendations for houseplants are to use those controlled release fertilizers, which are pelletized and basically have a plastic pellet that slowly and gradually releases nutrients at the root level over a period of time. And those are things like Osmocote or Nutricote or Dynamite. And there are different ratings for periods of time ranging from 90 days to 360 days, which is the length of time over which they will release the nutrients at an average of maybe 75 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And the recommendation that comes for selecting a fertilizer, you guys probably know that most fertilizers that you buy over the counter have 3 numbers on the front of the bag, which is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK. So you might see something that's 12-8-6 or 12-12-12, and that is the NPK ratio. And so the recommended ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for green foliage plants is usually 3 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus to 2 parts potassium. So something like 9-3-6 for a foliage plant, and you want relatively less nitrogen and more phosphorus for the flowering plant. So the recommended ratio is 2-3-1 for NPK. And remember, plants aren't growing at a uniform rate throughout the year, so the fertilizer needs are usually lower in the winter months. When it comes to plant selection, you really want to select species that match your growing conditions in the room. Remember that tropical understory species are more likely to deal with lower light indoor settings, but they do typically have higher humidity requirements. And so an example, you guys might recognize this plant in the lower left of this slide, which is the rattlesnake calathea, which I tried growing for quite some time inside my house, but I kept seeing these brown tips and brown spots along the edges. And when I really read about this plant, I realized I just wasn't providing enough humidity. And when I did some things to improve the humidity of the spot where I'm growing it, I had many less brown spots on the leaves and the plant looked a lot better. So you kind of got to pay attention to your plants and use the signals that they're giving you to adjust conditions so that they are growing better. The other thing to realize is that flowering and succulent plants usually have higher light intensity requirements. So they're going to want either very good direct sunlight at a southern or western exposure or supplemental lighting. So really what I'm talking about here is a holistic approach to plant care. And that's one in which we're focusing on giving a plant an environment that really matches the conditions in which it might be growing in nature. Observing the plant to see how it's performing and adjusting our care for the plant based on its performance instead of just blindly following a protocol. Like I'm going to water all of my houseplants, no matter what type they are, once a week. I'm giving them all a drink and I'm giving them the same amount of water. You got to think, okay, this plant has thicker leaves. It's a little more succulent. It probably doesn't need water quite as frequently. And the other thing too is that plant parents, particularly new plant parents, can really freak out when plants get yellow or brown leaves. But remember, plants senesce, they do lose lower leaves over time. And so as long as it's not the new foliage that's turning yellow or turning brown, a little loss of leaves, particularly the lower leaves, is a normal part of plant growth. And so we need to learn to accept that and realize that we might have to periodically repot plants or cut them back to keep them compact and bushy and to stimulate new growth. So they're not going to look ideal forever. I've got two pictures on this slide and I'm running low on time, but I'm just going to say the upper right picture, this is kind of a thing you often see at garden festivals where people will take these tillandsias, these air plants, and they'll glue them inside a seashell and then glue a magnet so that people can stick them on the front of their fridge. And so I just want you to think about this. Tillandsias are commonly called air plants. They're tropical epiphytes. They grow up in trees. And so most of them are exposed to relatively high light conditions up off the ground. And so can you imagine any more low light conditions than the front of most of our refrigerators, which are far away from windows? I always think it's highly counterintuitive to take an epiphyte tillandsia that is adapted for high light conditions and put it in a magnet on top in front of your fridge. I kind of think of that as plant torture. The one other thing I'll talk about is that the plant in the lower right is a croton, and I tried repeatedly to grow different varieties of crotons in my house inside, but my light conditions were just too low, and I pretty much resigned myself to the idea that I couldn't grow crotons. But then I saw in a garden center, a variety of croton that is called Eburnium, which is in the lower right, and it is specifically mentioned as being one that is tolerant of lower light conditions. And so a very generous master gardener down in Brevard County gave me a piece of her Eburnium croton, and miracle of miracles, this one actually performed well in indoors. So just because you can't succeed with one type of philodendron doesn't mean that you can't necessarily succeed with others. You need to realize that there are different species that, or different cultivars that will have slightly different requirements and characteristics. So I'm really here to advocate the idea of being a low impact plant parent. This means buying locally whenever possible instead of buying from online vendors, just because the carbon footprint of shipping, packing, and so on can be quite high. Trying to be conscious of the growing media you're using and reducing the use of sphagnum peat-based media because it is a non-renewable resource. Being mindful of your water and fertilizer use, particularly if you are taking plants outdoors to water and fertilize them. If you're using a soluble fertilizer, the blue food, and pouring it through, it could run off and down the cement and into the sewage system down at the street. And particularly, depending on which part of the state you're in, being mindful that quite a few houseplants can become invasive when they are placed outdoors and escape into the wild. So you can see this golden pothos in the image on the lower right, which has become a very aggressive invasive weed in the southern part of the state. as is arrowhead vine, the tuberous sword fern, almost statewide, several species of asparagus fern, several species of wandering Jew, and the creeping inch plant. All of these are plants that were introduced as houseplants in Florida that have escaped to the wild and have become invasive. So houseplants should stay in the house. If you want to move them outside into a protected area to water them, that's fine, but they really shouldn't be moved out into the yard where they could potentially reseed or escape from the pot and become an environmental hazard. Okay, so let's very briefly just fly through some slides talking about my favorite groups of houseplants for my home. And my very first is the Chinese evergreens or aglaonemas. These are old-fashioned houseplants that have seen a renewed interest as a result of a bunch of breeding that's coming out of Thailand and Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, where they're breeding this species from the lower left to get pink colors and reddish colors in the foliage. And these are highly tropical species that really resent being exposed to chills in front of windows. So a little tougher in North Florida as house plants. They need to be protected from drafty conditions, but tough, very tolerant of infrequent or inconsistent watering, and surprisingly durable of low humidity. There is a great array of philodendrons. This is a mega genus of plants with about 1,000 species, mostly native to tropical America, and it includes both vining types and heading types, and most of them are very well adapted to low light conditions in indoor settings with very attractive foliage, less often showy flowers. The ZZ plant, I know one of our participants mentioned ZZ as one of their favorite indoor plants. This is Zamioculcas zamiifolia. The traditional form has these glossy green leaves on thick succulent stems, which makes it very tolerant of infrequent watering. There are newer cultivars with variegated leaves and also the patented cultivar Raven with these beautiful glossy purple black leaves. And I've seen ZZ plant growing in everything from full sun to deep shade and doing well. And I've also seen it and I've experienced it myself in places where it hasn't gotten water for months at a time. And because it makes a thick tuberous rootstock, it is very tough in low light conditions. Begonias is another mega genus of plants. There are over 2,000 species of begonias worldwide, mostly from tropical areas. And these include both the rhizomatous begonias that are bunching at ground level, as well as the cane types like the angel wings, as well as the Rex begonias with the very showy, fancy foliage. All of the begonias have the potential to be good houseplants, but I will point out that most of them tend to have thinner textured leaves, so they do typically require higher humidity conditions, and they'll tend to get more brown spots on the leaves in less than ideal humidity. Peperomia is another mega genus with many of them being succulent, but there are non-succulent forms. It includes both vining types and heading or rosette types with many different types of very attractive foliage and kind of thin rat tail-like flowering stalks like you see in the upper right. Peperomias are one of those groups of plants that really seem to rot out in the winter months when they get too much water, so they benefit from having a relatively dry winter break and then more water and nutrition in the summer months in higher light conditions. Hoyas are a group of vining epiphytes, so they grow up in trees and tropical areas. There are several hundred species of Hoyas, as well as some hybrids with big, showy, waxy, and fragrant flowers. Because they're epiphytes, they're very tolerant of low humidity conditions. So I've got a big collection of Hoyas, which I keep hanging under my carport, the eaves of my carport, in hanging baskets in the warm season, but in the winter months, because they're tropical, I move them inside into my Florida room, and they get no water at all and a significant reduction in light during those winter months. And I'm amazed at how durable they are during the winter months with less water and lower light. And then when I move them back out under the carport at this time of year, once the danger of frost has passed, they resume growth right away. So Hoyas are tough plants, and they become very popular and increasingly more expensive as people are trying to collect the different species. Dracaena is another classic understory plant. There are several hundred species of Dracaena with several areas of diversity, including both tropical Africa and tropical Asia, with a few species from tropical America. And I think of these as being analogous to begonias in that there's a great diversity of leaf forms, but they do typically require higher humidity environments. The other thing I'll point out about Dracaenas is that they are particularly sensitive to chlorine and fluoride in tap water. So a lot of our municipalities will put chlorine to disinfect water or put fluoride for dental health in tap water. And that will manifest in yellowing, which you're seeing here on the upper right, or brown tips. So with Dracaenas, you typically want to run tap water into a container and leave it open and exposed for at least 24 hours, and that chlorine and fluoride will evaporate off. Or use rainwater that you've collected, or use distilled water. But using water directly from the tap can create problems with Dracaenas. Of course, there are the snake plants, or Sansevierias, which some taxonomists now include in with the genus of Dracaena. These are super tough, fibrous-leaved plants. There are about 100 plus species plus many hybrids. There are a few that are invasive in the central and southern part of the state, so you'd want to avoid putting those outdoors. But there are another, 100 plus species that are not documented to be invasive, including some with just super sexy foliage, like these big fat whale fin types, and ones with really glossy, super thick marbled foliage. And I'm just a huge fan of Sansevierias because they're tough as nails and very slow to show if they're unhappy with their growing conditions. So infrequent water and suboptimal light, they've got you covered. And for more information, I encourage you to visit the Garden Solutions website and search under the topic houseplants. There's also a number of, there's an infinite number of houseplant books, but the ones that I really enjoy and find myself going to over and over again is the Reader's Digest Success with Houseplants, which is the very first houseplant that I purchased from a thrift store when I moved out of the dorm into my first apartment. This book was first published in the 1970s and has been reprinted a number of times. It's an oldie, but a goodie with super high quality information and very comprehensive. The Houseplant Expert, which is a newer plant geared for the new generation of indoor growers with larger, higher quality photos and very good information. Here is Daryl Chang's book, The New Plant Parent, which I mentioned kind of coins that idea of holistic indoor plant care. And the book that professional foliage plant growers are using is this book by Lynn Griffith, who was from Southeast Florida, nurseryman, an advisor and foliage plant expert. And this book is called Tropical Foliage Plants, which is basically a technical guide for folks in the nursery industry to produce large-scale foliage houseplants for sale. There are also some extension documents available on light and fertilizer recommendations. And if you're concerned about toxicity of houseplants because you've got pets or small children, there are also extension articles co-authored by next month's featured speaker, Chris Marble, who is amazing. And Chris has an EDIS document on common poisonous houseplants. And we are over the time, but if you guys are interested, I'm more than happy to entertain questions, which I think Claire will share with us, or Rebecca.
Hello, I'm back.
Yeah,
Okay,
Claire.
so I'm surprised, guys. You only have four. Okay, I was gonna say, yeah, you got your expert here for your houseplant babies. Okay, so let's start with pest control question. This person has spider mites on their parlor palms.
Ooh. Spider mites are tough. They are resilient and they have a short generation, so they have a lot of turnover. So typically, if you spray something that kills the adults, you might not necessarily kill the eggs, and they like crevices, like at the bases of leaves. So it can be extremely hard to control spider mites with sprays. That means that generally you are going to have better results with something that drenches the soil, and that the insecticide is actually taken up into the soil roots. These are known as systemic insecticides. Now, there are some systemics that you can spray on the leaves and will be absorbed by the leaf surface, but in general, systemics have higher absorption when they're used as a drench. So there are groups of products that are recommended specifically as miticides, as insecticides that kill mites. And so you'd want to go to your favorite garden center, whether it's a box store or an independent local garden center, and ask them what they'd recommend as a soil drench for a miticide. And tell them that you have spider mites on an indoor plant and that it's really not, that you haven't had success controlling them by other means. Good luck. Mites are tough. Claire, you're muted.
Sorry, I got it back. Sorry. Is there a type of pot that works better than another terracotta plastic glazed?
Oh, yeah. So this is a common question about plastic versus unglazed terracotta versus glazed. So let's go back and talk about the different requirements, right? You got a succulent plant and you want to ensure that the soil remains well drained. Obviously, a pot that is glazed and is not allowing the penetration, the loss of moisture through the pot is going to be less good. So I tend to avoid glazed pots with plants that need to drain out. Conversely, with succulent plants or plant species where I'm really concerned about them rotting, I will go with the unglazed pot. Whereas plants that I'm worried about wilting, I'll be more likely to go with a glazed pot. I've also generally noticed that as I repot plants and they get larger, it gets harder and harder to move the terracotta and glazed and the fancy pots outdoors or from room to room. And so I have increasingly become a fan of large multi-gallon, because I've got some really mature, Sansevierias in like 15-gallon pots. And I am too old and too feeble at this time to be able to move a 15-gallon glazed pot, but a plastic pot I can still manage to drag outdoors. So it really kind of depends on how big it is, how much you're going to move it, and what kind of moisture regime you want to have in the soil. So there is room for all. There is room for plastic, unglazed terracotta, and glazed terracotta, depending on your particular circumstances, how big and how much you're moving it.
Okay, do you have any suggestions of plants for an 8-year-old really interested in growing houseplants?
Oh, I'm defaulting. You gotta love a Sansevieria. There's so many cool Sansevierias, different shapes. They're very tactile. They're thick and tough. They're hard to break. They make babies pretty readily. Everyone loves a baby plant, particularly a kid. Um, if they're getting enough light, they'll make flower spikes, and the flowers are actually fragrant. And the reason they're fragrant at night, so that's actually for moth pollination. So then you could start conversations with your kid, like, what kind of insect do you think would pollinate a flower at night, and make them put on their thinking caps and think about what might be a night active insect. There's all kinds of things you could do with that. So I'm saying snake plants. Succulents, everyone loves succulents, but I do have to say that there's a higher rate of failure with succulents because of the light requirements. So if you're going to go the succulent route, everyone loves succulents because they're small and cute and there's infinite variety, but just make sure that you're having great light conditions, because there's nothing that's going to dampen the enthusiasm of a new young potential gardener than a failure. You want to have them succeed so that they'll want to do more. And the snake plant is a no fail kind of starter plant.
This is an interesting question to me. It looks like Christmas cactus are medium light, not during the pre-blooming period, but I find so much light turns the foliage red. Is there any way to avoid this change in foliage color?
So that red is a natural thing that plants do under highlight conditions, and it tends to be seasonal. Often we will see increased red in the fall months or in the spring months. And also we will see it in newer foliage. The thing that amazes me with Christmas cacti is that you can have them, once they have initiated flower buds, you can move them into relatively low light to medium light indoor conditions. But I have some Christmas cacti that I actually move out on shelves onto my back patio, which is a northern exposure, but still quite bright sun. They're not on the ground, they're up on shelves, and they do amazingly well. I haven't actually noticed the reddening of their leaves, but I would say if you're concerned about the reddening of the leaves on your Christmas cacti, it's probably an indicator that the foot candles are a little too high. And there might be a wavelength component to it as well.
Okay, I have a squeaky chair. That's why I keep putting myself on mute. Okay.
Don't you worry.
I wonder if you know this. Because I have a backup question if you don't know it. What type of plants are not appetizing to iguanas?
Okay. I have never had a pet iguana.
Oh, this is South Florida. This is the South Florida
Yeah,
iguana.
right.
No.
I know. Iguana Central. I'm in North Florida. Iguanas would be very cold. So I haven't actually experimented with iguanas. Like I haven't adopted an iguana to see what it wants to nibble on. But if I was going to go out on a limb, I would tell you first of all the snake plants because the foliage is fibrous. So I would guess that it would be fairly unpalatable to iguanas. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Put something in the chat. If you have observed iguanas to be gnawing on snake plants. The other thing that I would suspect is that everything in the aroid family, so that includes the ZZ plant, the pothos, the philodendrons and their relatives, the peace lily, the anthuriums, they all have these oxalate crystals in their leaves, which can actually cause an unpleasant sensation in the lining of the mouth. They're actually sharp crystals. And so I'm wondering if those would affect little iguana or big iguana mouths if they were to nibble on things in the aroid family. So that is going to be my guess, my educated guess on a question that I admittedly don't really know the answer to.
Okay, we're gonna do our last question here. Have you tried bromeliads as houseplants? And if so, how would you fertilize?
I have tried bromeliads as houseplants. So I have to tell you, as a family, the bromeliaceae is adapted to highlight conditions. A certain group of them are epiphytes that grow up in tree limbs, particularly in some habitats that are seasonally dry. So at certain times of year, the canopy of the trees loses some leaves and the light penetration is really good. And another subset of them are terrestrial from a desert habitat. That's the hectias and the dichias, like that cherry coke dichia that's very popular as a landscape plant in Florida. So as a rule, bromeliads are fairly highlight plants. The ones that I've had the most success with are a couple of genera that tend to be more likely to be found in understory environments. And that includes the neoregelias, which are the ones that tend to flush red in the center and are shaped a little more like a flatter bird's nest. And some of them have very attractive marbled foliage. There's a cultivar called Fireball that's very popular for landscape use. There's a whole bunch of Fireball variegated forms. And I've just found the neoregelias in general have been pretty durable. I've had less success with most other genera of bromeliads, particularly the tillandsias and the echinus as indoor plants. I've tried them, and I have some really tropical ones that I've moved indoors for the winter months. And as long as I move them indoors and then move them back out into higher light conditions as soon as the danger of frost is done, because I have tillandsias hanging underneath the eaves of my house outside, some of those air plants, but I can't leave them inside year round. It's just too low light conditions.
Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. We have our next webinar on March 18th, and it's at 11 a.m. And we're going to be talking, as I said at the beginning, about homeowner herbicides and using them safely. So we'd love to have you back for that. And you know what, Mark, it was a pleasure having you today, and we all learned a lot. And thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see everyone at our next webinar.
Thank you, Claire. I just want to give a plug. Next month's speaker, Chris, is extremely knowledgeable and he's a great speaker. So log in for that.